I'm Susan Yawkey with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, high-level U.S.-Iraqi talks. Arab Spring migrants are trapped by Italy's crisis. Israel approves a plan to curb a flood of migrants. Palestinians are outraged by a U.S. presidential hopeful's comments.
We've had an invented Palestinian people who are in fact Arabs and are historically part of the Arab community.
And water shortages threaten the Middle East. It's all ahead on VOA. U.S. President Barack Obama has been holding talks at the White House today with Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Joining us on the line is senior White House correspondent Dan Robinson. Dan, please tell us about the importance of these talks.
Well, as you know, President Obama has cited his fulfillment of his promise to withdraw U.S. forces from Iraq. He made that pledge as a presidential candidate in 2008. This has been a 9-year conflict. Some 4,500 American soldiers have died, thousands, tens of thousands of wounded. Iraqi casualties, at least 10 or 11 or 12,000 on the Iraqi military side. At this point, though, the two nations are not quite in agreement as to how the United States might be helping Iraq in case things get bad again there in terms of an uptick in violence and that kind of thing.
Well, what are the options for the United States in Iraq in the future?
Again, there were negotiations going on for the two countries to come to some kind of agreement for a continuing U.S. troop presence, but the two sides were just not able to come to an agreement on that. President Obama, Vice President Biden, the administration here generally says the violence has gone down in Iraq from its high point a number of years ago, and that's probably the case, although you have bombings going on every week or so across Iraq. So there's still that possibility that things may become unstable there, but that's not what they're focusing on today. They're focusing on the expansion of the U.S. diplomatic and civilian presence in there. You're going to have a U.S. civilian and other presence, meaning contractors, of between 15 and 16,000. The U.S. Embassy in Baghdad is going to be the largest in the world for the United States. So there's going to be a continuing and strengthened U.S. presence generally in Iraq, but not of the military type.
So basically there will not be a military presence, but the diplomatic presence will be increased.
Yeah, well, they're going to have to discuss training. I mean, that's the point that's outstanding at this point, how training will be undertaken on an ongoing basis. But again, the U.S. presence is on expanding economic and diplomatic civilian cooperation with Iraq in a long-term relationship.
Well, thank you, Dan.
Okay.
VOA correspondent Dan Robinson speaking with us from the White House.
Are you looking for a comprehensive daily look at events reshaping the Middle East? Visit voanews.com/ME. You'll find VOA's original reporting from the region, in-depth analysis from our Washington team, VIP interviews, online polls, photo essays, and mini documentaries. Bookmark us or add us to your RSS reader. That's voanews.com/ME.
Fierce clashes between Syrian security forces and army defectors continued in several parts of the country today, as Syrians voted in municipal elections held amid a general strike and an escalating crackdown on anti-government protesters. The London-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the latest fighting between soldiers and defectors is taking place in northwestern Idlib province and in southern Daraa province. The observatory said 7 people were reported killed today in the flashpoint regions of Homs and Idlib. The elections cover more than 17,000 seats on local councils across the country's 14 provinces. The poll comes amid increasing international pressure on the government to stop its crackdown on protesters. Amin Sakal, director of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at Australian National University, tells VOA's Victor Beattie he doubts the results of the elections will be seen as credible given the unrest.
The opposition feels very much intimidated and will be voting under the power of the government gun, and therefore I doubt it very seriously that either the opposition or, for that matter, the international community would consider the elections to be a legitimate one.
In the fighting that's going on in the country, you have army deserters. They're armed, and they're fighting back against security forces. Are we in a civil war in Syria?
I think the Russian foreign minister had announced even last week that Syria was descending into civil war, and I think that is what's really transpiring. I think more and more army deserters are taking up arms against the government, and all the reports that we receive that there has been fighting in different parts of Syria, and to me it looks like that the country is sliding towards a civil war unless the Assad regime does something very dramatic to arrest the situation. And at this point, I cannot really see any signs on the part of the Assad regime to do something which could possibly either save the regime or, for that matter, enable the population to take over power.
In Vienna yesterday, Israel's defense minister, Mr. Ehud Barak, said Mr. Assad's downfall would be, quote, a blessing for the Middle East, and he predicted the Syrian regime would be forced out of power within weeks.
I think that seems to be one view in the region, but at the same time, President Assad has made it very clear that he will go on fighting. He and the people around him know that if the regime goes down, they will go down with the regime, and it is now becoming a question of self-survival rather than taking the national interests of the country into account. My hunch at this point is that this conflict is likely to go on for some time to come, but at the end, I think the Assad regime will find it extremely difficult to remain in power. But another alternative may be to the whole situation that somebody else may take over from Assad, but no one has come forward so far. That is from within his own regime. I mean, until such time that he has control over the armed forces and or at least segments of the armed forces, and they are prepared to fight for him, then I think this conflict is going to go on.
Do you see any Western intervention as occurred in Libya, or do you see reasons why they would not intervene?
The United States and its allies have made it really quite clear that they are not going to intervene in Syria, simply because that they do not think that they are in a position to carry out another intervention. The United States wants to disentangle itself from Iraq by the end of this year, and it wants to really draw down its forces from Afghanistan. In the meantime, I doubt it seriously that the European countries have the necessary political will at this point and the necessary international legitimacy to intervene in the way that they did in Libya. China and Russia are still standing behind the Syrian regime, and therefore they have not indicated clearly that they will be supporting a UN security resolution for intervention in the way that they did in the case of Libya.
Amin Sakail, Director of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at Australian National University. We invite you to join in with your views at our online poll. This week we ask, what role will Sharia law play in Egypt's new constitution? Just visit our website at voanews.com/ME and enter your vote. That's at voanews.com/ME. The flow of migrants from Libya to Europe has resumed following the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in October. Since the uprisings in Libya and Tunisia earlier this year, tens of thousands of migrants have departed across the Mediterranean for a new life. The reality of trying to build a new life in Europe is often a long way from the hopes and dreams of the migrants. And as Henry Ridgewell reports, Italy's economic crisis is also hitting the newcomers hard.
From afar, the ramshackle huts crammed on the edge of the vast green fields resemble a refugee camp. The residents call it the ghetto, a squalid shanty town on the outskirts of Foggia in southern Italy, which is home to over 600 immigrants. The region is known as the Red Gold Triangle, producing 35% of Italy's tomatoes, most of them picked and processed by armies of migrant workers every fall. Dr. Alvise Benelli of Doctors Without Borders helps care for the workers.
Dormono per terra, materassi recuperati per strada, la maggior parte fradici.
He says they sleep on the ground on mattresses they have picked up on the streets. Most of them are rotten and infested with insects. This year, due to Italy's economic crisis, factories in Italy's rich north laid off employees, forcing an extra 2,000 migrants to head south looking for work. A clampdown on illegal migrants means fewer farmers are willing to hire them. The few jobs available pay around $45 for toiling in the fields, dawn till dusk. Andrea came here several years ago from Burkina Faso.
Sì, è vero, perché veramente noi non sapevo che Italia era così.
We just didn't know Italy was like this. We always thought it was a country where we would find jobs and do everything like eating and a lot of nice things, he says. Now we have seen it is not like that, but I can't go back. As the uprisings in Tunisia and Libya ignited earlier this year, tens of thousands of migrants from across Africa and the Middle East began to leave the northern shores headed for Europe. Hundreds have drowned on the journey. Most who survive arrive on the tiny Italian island of Lampedusa before being taken to the Italian mainland. A few legitimately claim asylum. Most stay illegally. A group of 400 migrants trying to leave Tripoli last week was stopped by Libyan patrol boats. Mans Nyberg is spokesman for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees.
It appears that now, after the end of the Libya fighting and the crisis, that the migration has resumed across the Mediterranean. So again, we see small rickety boats approaching Italy, approaching Malta from Libya. This is happening during the months of winter, which of course are very dangerous in the Mediterranean with storms.
Italy has launched an amnesty for some immigrants employed as cleaners or carers for the elderly, but not for illegal immigrants like the residents of the ghetto. With no official papers and barely any income, they are trapped, far from home and a long way from the hopes and dreams that set them on their way to Europe. Henry Richwell for VOA News.
Israel is taking steps to curb the influx of migrant workers arriving from Africa. Robert Berger reports from the VOA Bureau in Jerusalem.
With about 2,000 African migrants illegally entering Israel each month, the cabinet approved a program to deal with what it sees as a growing threat. The $167 million plan calls for speeding up construction of a security fence on the porous border with Egypt's Sinai Peninsula from where the migrants are smuggled into Israel. Detention facilities will be constructed and expanded to hold the migrants, and employers who hire them will be fined. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel must take decisive action before it is too late. This is a national epidemic, Mr. Netanyahu told the cabinet. He said it poses a threat to Israel economically, socially, and from the standpoint of security. Officials say more than 40,000 illegal African migrants have entered Israel since 2006, most of them from war-torn Sudan and Eritrea. That has raised alarm in a small Jewish state already facing a growing demographic threat from the Palestinians. Mr. Netanyahu warned that if the trend is not stopped, the number of Africans entering Israel could rise to 100,000 a year. We have no obligation to receive illegal migrants, he said, adding that if Israel does not stop the flood, the nation will be swept away by it. The issue poses a moral dilemma for Israel because during the Holocaust, Jewish refugees fleeing from the Nazis were turned away from Western countries. Reut Michaeli, who heads Israel's hotline for migrant workers, says the government's response is wrong. Michaeli told Israel Radio that Israel is a nation of refugees that was established by refugees, and therefore it has an obligation to open its doors to Africans who have fled from war and persecution. But the government says the vast majority of Africans arriving here are economic migrants and not refugees. Prime Minister Netanyahu plans to travel to several African nations soon to discuss repatriating the migrants. Robert Berger for VOA News, Jerusalem.
If you crave the latest news and analysis about the Middle East, follow us on our Twitter feed. You can find it by searching at VOA Middle East. Every day we tweet VOA's own special reports, analysis, VIP interviews, photo essays, and mini documentaries. Plus, you'll get the latest buzz from VOA's Mideast team and correspondents. VOA Middle East on Twitter. Get a read on the news before it happens. Palestinians have expressed outrage at Republican U.S. presidential candidate Newt Gingrich, who described them as an uninvented people. In an interview with the Jewish Channel, a cable television channel in the United States, Gingrich departed from official American policy, which supports the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel.
There was no Palestine as a state. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. And I think that we've had an invented Palestinian people who are in fact Arabs and were historically part of the Arab community. And they had a chance to go many places. And for a variety of political reasons, we have sustained this war against Israel now since the 1940s. I think it's tragic.
Palestinian officials described the remarks as despicable and racist. Negotiator Saeb Erekat accused Gingrich of denying the existence of the Palestinian people and said that will lead to more hatred and violence.
These statements is really inciting for bloodshed of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the regions, and we don't need such low level of political statements.
For years, Erekat has been a top negotiator in peace talks with Israel aimed at a two-state solution. He said Gingrich's comments harm Palestinian moderates and strengthen the militants.
Mark my words, these statements of Gingrich will be the ammunition and weapons of the bin Ladens and the extremists for a long time to do.
A spokesman for Gingrich says the candidate supports a negotiated peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, but Palestinian officials say Gingrich has shown the world that he is not fit to be president of the United States. Serious water shortages are threatening the lives and livelihoods of millions of people across the Middle East amid increasing populations, climate change, poor infrastructure, and inefficient use of water resources. Edward Uranian reports on the growing regional crisis from our bureau in Cairo.
Workers leave the showers running at Cairo's Posh Gezira Club as they sit nearby drinking tea and chatting. Large quantities of water go down the drain every day as water pipes in other parts of Cairo and its suburbs run dry. Hossam Abdul-Razak, who lives in the poor Cairo neighborhood of Zukak al-Blat, complains that water no longer even runs in government pipes to his area most of the time. He says that housewives must trek to a local water dealer to buy the precious liquid. He says that water doesn't even come to his area at all, and when it does come for 5 minutes, the kids run to the faucets to drink. The ladies, he adds, go to buy water from a company that sells it for 25 cents so they can bring it back home to cook with and drink from. Official Egyptian government statistics indicate that the country uses 55 billion cubic meters of water per year and that 87% of that quantity comes from the River Nile. A conflict with neighboring states downriver, however, is creating tension and could exacerbate the crisis. Those states, which include Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and southern Sudan, argue that they should get a larger share of the Nile's waters. Egypt and Sudan insist that a British colonial agreement gives them the right to use most of the Nile's waters. Omar Ashur, who teaches political science at the University of Exeter in Britain, says that Egypt is paying a price for the years of benign neglect towards its southern neighbors.
What we're harvesting now is decades of bad foreign policy when it comes to the Central African and southern neighbors. During Mubarak time, there was the complete ignoring of development projects, of cooperation, and there was this superiority-inferiority complex reflected in the foreign policy towards the neighbors to the south, especially Ethiopia, Uganda, and Southern Sudan and Sudan. And there was this assumption that they were allies and friends during Nasser's time, and that will remain the situation regardless of how Egypt treats them.
Ashur notes that youth leaders from the country's January Revolution met with the presidents of both Ethiopia and Uganda in a goodwill gesture to repair strained ties. Water, he stresses, is pretty much one of the most sensitive national security and foreign policy issues for Egypt. Across the Red Sea in war-torn Yemen, residents of the capital Sana'a tell VOA that government water comes to their houses so infrequently that they are forced to pay to haul it from outside the city by truck. United Nations Development Program statistics also indicate that the levels of Yemen's 21 main aquifers are falling by 7 meters per year on average. This leads some experts to argue that the country will be completely out of potable water within 5 to 10 years. Hakim al-Masmari, who is editor-in-chief of the Yemen Post newspaper, insists that less than 10% of the country gets its water from the government, and that the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, could be the first capital in the world to run out of water. He blames poor infrastructure and the culture of Yemen's ubiquitous narcotic khat tree for the problem.
First of all, there's no real infrastructure that can help in using the rainwater appropriately. And so everything that is being used in Yemen is the underground water. And 70% of that water goes to khat plantation, which is a drug. And Yemenis only seem to be growing it more and more by the day.
To the north, in Lebanon and Syria, where it rains more frequently, poor infrastructure prevents the capture of considerable quantities of rainwater which end up in the sea. Professor Louis Hobe'a, who teaches economics at Lebanon's Notre Dame University, also points out that water is priced inexpensively, encouraging people to squander it.
People abuse the consumption of water because the price is low, and there is no metering system. For example, in Lebanon, we don't have meters in the use of water. We pay an annual fee, and it's independent of how much water you consume, which is frankly ridiculous. It pushes people to overconsume and to waste it.
Hobe'a stresses that bad political relations between most of the countries in the region tend to exacerbate the water crisis. He notes that Lebanon and Israel have a history of quarreling over water from southern Lebanon's Litani River.
Economic and political relationship among countries in the Middle East is usually bad, and therefore water is one of the sources of conflict in the region. So water is available, however, there are conflicts among countries regarding how to channel water properly and avoiding unnecessary conflicts. The water of the Litani River in Lebanon is one of those important examples of current and especially potential conflicts between us and Israel.
An economic conference in Syria last month also claimed that an ongoing agricultural crisis across large swaths of the country is the direct result of Turkish government projects to build dams that limit the flow of water to both Syria and neighboring Iraq. One expert insisted that the water crisis was a key catalyst for the recent popular unrest in the country. Edward Uranian for VOA News, Cairo.
This has been VOA's Middle East Monitor. Join us Monday through Friday for news from the region and of interest to the region. Coming up on International Edition, making the case for city living. Thanks for tuning in to the Voice of America.
For more on the stories you've heard on our radio programs, visit our website at voanews.com. That's where you'll find in-depth reports, related stories, videos, and more from our team of correspondents. Or take the news with you by downloading podcasts of your favorite VOA programs. That's at voanews.com.
voanews.com.
Online news for a changing world.